Hey, nice Atypical Daydream t-shirt.
Thanks. It's my favorite podcast.
Mine too. But where can I get a t-shirt?
It's easy. The link is in the show notes.
That is easy. I'm gonna go get one right now.
That's a great idea.
Thanks. Bye.
You bet. Stay cool.
Protesters are absolutely screaming in the faces of these police. And the police are just standing there. And the anger for me there was something I wasn't really used to covering, especially not in a broadcast medium. So I didn't know exactly how to think about it other than to say to Brian Williams, people here are so angry. It feels like they're not really going to leave until there's a confrontation.
Hello, my Atypical Daydreamers. Welcome to the show. It's great to be back. I took a 6-month hiatus to record guests, make music, and rethink the show. And I am thrilled, delighted, dare I say, tickled pink about this year's upcoming guests. It has been a journey since recording my first guest back in 2021, and I'm glad I stuck with it. Going forward, episodes will come out every other week, all throughout 2025. And of course, there'll be lots of bonus stories at my Patreon on the off weeks. My guest today is Jacob Ward. He's a journalist and writer with a focus in science and technology. At its core, this podcast is about life outside of our comfort zones. Jake shows us that sometimes you don't have to travel very far to find the unfamiliar and unexpected, even just a few neighborhoods over.
I was the NBC News technology correspondent for 5 years. When I started that job, it was a really specific gig. I was supposed to cover the disinformation wars and the way in which, democracy is threatened and social media and, the effect on your kids. But COVID derailed all of that, as it did for so many people's personal and professional lives. We were in the Bay Area, where I live, one of the first communities to lock down, March 13th, 2020. You had Google shut down, Facebook, as it was known at the time, shut down. And that was the clearest indication anybody had that this was a big, big problem and about to be an even bigger problem. And I remember being on the broadcasts saying naively at the time, wow, this is so crazy. Look, I gave a tour of my house and my wife, and my kids, and us all trying to survive, a day stuck in the house quarantining. And I remember saying at the end of that broadcast, this is one day. What's it going to be like after 2 weeks? And little did I know, right, that we would all, of course, be locked out for more than a year. So the effect that COVID had specifically on those of us in the news business was to really upend our beats. So I went from being the kind of upbeat nerd who talks about tech problems to suddenly the regional reporter in Northern California, because we didn't want people flying if it was possible to avoid. We didn't want people getting COVID. This was pre-vaccine, so you were really trying to, be as careful as you possibly could with your people. So suddenly I was being asked to cover other things. For instance, I had to go cover wildfires that year, which was a really new thing for me. I knew, I'd been prepared for it a little bit. I'd done a little bit of this kind of coverage when I worked at another network in the past, but you're really supposed to, in California, get right up against the flames. You're supposed to really get out there and show the response, show the damage, show the danger. It's television, right? So if it doesn't, capture the eye, then you're not going to get your point across. And so that was, for me, an experience in really beginning to learn what it is to be one of these breaking news correspondents, which I hadn't really imagined I was going to be. People that I worked with at NBC would literally go to the airport and eat breakfast there before they even knew what they were going to be doing that day, because they knew they'd get the call and get put on a plane. And suddenly I was part of that. I was getting calls, in the middle of the night, in the middle of the weekend, go right now. And so in this case, right, like with wildfires, I would get sent. I remember getting a call and being sent all the way to Oregon to cover them. During COVID, I leave at 4 in the afternoon. I get there at 1 a.m. I had to take a nap for like 2 hours just to be able to function in a burning parking lot. I remember being parked in my car and embers are blowing across the hood as I just sleep with the recirculated air going. My responsibilities and my kind of psychological attunement had really changed because of COVID. And all of that really came to a head when George Floyd was murdered. So at the end of March 2020, right, not even a month after we had all locked down, the murder of George Floyd set off this national reckoning around the role of the police and racism and the legacy of slavery and all of these things, right, are suddenly coming to a head. And I was immediately dispatched to cover the protests in my hometown in Oakland, California. And that experience was totally transformative for me on so many levels, because you enter the realm of journalism really assuming that you're going to just sort of observe at a remove, and that the professional privilege, and it is a privilege that you are afforded in exchange for, taking this crazy job, is that you can observe without being truly endangered. In the old days, right, you as a journalist in the 1950s, 1960s could go and, cover an armed conflict, negotiate ahead of time with the opposing forces, and be more or less protected by your status as a journalist. Well, the difficulty with covering stuff, and this is true, of course, for all journalists right now, is that in this landscape where there is endless misinformation and disinformation, endless, partisan rancor, endless conspiracy theories, and it's no longer necessary to work through a journalist, especially even a broadcast journalist like me, to get your message out. There is no longer the kind of, I would say, protection that comes from wearing a press badge once upon a time. And a lot of the people that I know don't even wear that stuff anymore because, in fact, it makes you something of a target. And so I was suddenly put in the position in traveling to these protests of really having to see that up close. Most journalists are trained at some point when they do the kind of journalism that I do, the broadcast journalism, in hazardous environment training. And we, are trained to do all kinds of stuff, and we have to renew our training on a periodic basis. You learn how to put a splint on. You learn how to deal with, basic treatment of trauma injuries. You learn how to deal with tear gas and how to lie down in a certain way if someone throws a grenade into a crowd. Like you learn all kinds of stuff that I, as a journalist, thought I would never have to think about. And even going through that kind of training, I thought, well, I'm not going to need this. Like, I cover tech. I'm the nerd that just covers tech, right? But suddenly I, am sent at a moment's notice out to cover the protests in Oakland. Oakland is not a very big city. If you've never been here, you can get across town on foot, I would say, in under an hour. There are huge swaths of the city elsewhere that you got to drive to. But in terms of the sort of the center of the city and the places where I live and then where the protests are walking distance from one another. But traveling from one to the other, for me, over the course of about 2 weeks, was a long journey, because I went from covering this raw, deeply held, I would argue almost ancient anger on the part of protesters, to going home each night and doing dishes and doing laundry and tucking my kids in, right? And I would have to take my clothes off coming home in the backyard because they were covered in tear gas.
it's Josh. Hope you're enjoying the podcast. And if so, are you wanting more road stories? Well, good news. I've got you covered. Consider becoming a patron. You'll have access to loads of great bonus stories that there just wasn't time for. And you'll be supporting a truly independent podcast. Find the link in the show notes. And thanks. Now back to the show.
Here's what it's like to cover one of these protests. You show up and you have a little crew. In our case, it's 3 or 4 people. Typically, it's a correspondent, a producer, a camera operator, and an audio engineer. And the 4 of us in this case were, dispatched to basically be on standby and to let the broadcast headquarters in New York at 30 Rock know when we had something to show. And all over the nation, different teams like ours were doing that same thing. We were in what they call rolling coverage of the protests around George Floyd's death. And that coverage and that experience, is very improvisational. You are walking through the crowd, in our case, we'd walk through the crowd and people would engage us, and typically not in a hugely friendly way. You would get people coming up to you to sort of ask where you're from, what network you're from. Some people in my job I know don't like to say because they worry about the reaction they're going to get. I'm pretty honest about it every time because I just figure our job is to be as transparent as we possibly can. And so I would just tell people, we're from NBC News. And I remember running into this one little group of protesters and them asking us who we were and what we were with. And I saw this, fierce anger in them. And there was a moment where they really wanted to be angry at us about what we were doing. But I managed to sort of, I wouldn't say talk them out of it, but I just kept being honest with them about, here's what we do. Here's the standards we try to bring to it. Everything I say is, can get me in trouble. And so I really am trying to be as honest as I can. The illusion that so many people have that we're just kind of making it up as we go along is weird and untrue. So I remember kind of gaining their trust in a way that I felt really good about. But I also then bumped into them again later in the protest, a day later, after we'd been up very late covering sort of the end of a day of protest. And I remember being on the air live talking to Brian Williams, who was the anchor at that hour, and just kind of giving him a tour of what's going on. And I said at one point, these, because there was this phalanx of police standing there and then this phalanx of protesters. And the protesters are absolutely screaming in the faces of these police. And the police are just standing there. And the anger for me there was something I wasn't really used to covering, especially not in a broadcast medium. So I didn't know exactly how to think about it other than to say to Brian Williams, people here are so angry. It feels like they're not really going to leave until there's a confrontation, until there's a fight of some kind. And the next day, those same protesters, that same group that I bumped into, came up to me very angry and said, you misrepresented what we were about. You said that we were there to fight. We weren't there to fight. We weren't there for that reason. We were there to make our voices heard. And I learned in that experience that my job is not to give my summary of what I think is going on. My job is to get them on the air to talk about their feelings about what's going on. So there were some really fundamental sort of journalistic lessons for me in that experience. And again, I've never covered protests before. That was the first time for me. Then there was just the general danger of being in the middle of a confrontation between police and protesters. And I have this tremendously talented sound engineer that I got to work with named Brian Bayetta. Brian was always just sort of coming up with smart stuff before we even kind of knew what was happening. And one night we are out there, and this is COVID. So I've got a mask on during the broadcast. Everyone's got masks on. And we're in the middle of Oakland's Chinatown, walking along. Suddenly, police begin firing tear gas.
Hitting people with tear gas like this gentleman here.
And this happens just as 30 Rock takes us. That's the phrase we use for putting us on the air, for putting us live. So suddenly I'm on live television on MSNBC being tear gassed at that moment. And I lose the camera crew on the air. They disappear from my vision because I'm so discombobulated by the tear gas that's coming our way. You can hear me in the footage speaking into the microphone, but I think I basically say something like, I have lost the crew. And one of our security guys, God bless him, finds me and pulls me back into the shot out of the crowd. And from there, I go on to talk about the history of protests in Oakland and how, Oscar Grant, who was killed by a BART police officer, and, all the way back to the Black Panthers. There's a long tradition of this kind of thing. Anyway, I managed to sort of give some context and talk about the moment that we're in as people are like setting fires next to me. Again, I have this tear gas going. So, we're so discombobulated by this. And I just wasn't prepared. I didn't have a gas mask with me. I just didn't have the equipment that I really needed. And the next day, we've all got gas masks this time. And Brian, God bless him, has put a microphone inside the gas mask. He has taped a little what we call lav mic inside the gas mask. And the receiver is in there too. So the seal around my face is not broken. And it gave me the opportunity to be able to talk through a gas mask. And we got tear gassed again that day. But the strangeness of needing to kind of keep your cool, deliver as dispassionate an analysis of what's happening as you can in the midst of all of this craziness is that I learned a deep new understanding for the difficulty of that job and how important that is. But again, that vibe of being at your house where you're trying not to get any of the tear gas on any of the home stuff around your kids as you're tucking them in, that was like 2 miles away from where I was, being tear gassed by the police. The cognitive dissonance for me of going from covering protests over the murder of a man at the hands of the police and being in that danger contrasted with what it is to try and be a good and functioning human with your family at the end of that day. When you get home to your kids and read them a story and look at what they made on, what they drew that day. I have traveled a lot for that job. I have been all over the country. In some cases, I've been abroad. This is, I would say, the furthest psychologically that I have ever traveled as a journalist.
I want to thank Jake for sharing his experience. Be sure to check out his book, The Loop, How Technology is Creating a World Without Choices and How to Fight Back. And his newsletter, The Rip Current, about big, invisible forces in tech, politics, and human behavior. Subscribe at theripcurrent.com. This podcast is created and produced by me, Josh Caldwell. Music by Visual Aid, my side music project. General support and copywriting by Miranda Caldwell. And if you know someone who you think might enjoy this show, send them this episode. The support really helps. Thank you for listening, and I hope you come back next time.